I woke up bald, on the day the nation was supposed to honor me on live television. My evening gown was shredded. My door wasn't forced open. It was someone I trusted. I had never felt so humiliated in my life. 72 years of sacrifice wiped away with a single act of cruelty. But they didn't know that this would also be the day they'd lose everything. What would you do if your own children turned you into a joke, right before the world applauded you? I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I just sat there, on the edge of my bed, with my fingers still trembling against the smooth skin of my scalp. The morning light was pouring in through the blinds, gentle and golden. But nothing about that moment was soft. It felt like I'd been hollowed out and left to rot in silence. My silk pillowcase was on the floor, tangled, with thin strands of grey clinging to the fabric. I don't remember pulling it off. Maybe I had. Or maybe it fell when I jolted awake and felt nothing. No hair, no texture, just skin, cold and bare. I stood up slowly and walked toward the closet. That's when I saw it. My gown, the navy blue one I'd chosen weeks ago, the one with the delicate beading that reminded me of stars, shredded, torn from the waist down like an animal had clawed through it. Except it wasn't an animal. It was human, calculated, personal. I didn't need evidence. I didn't need a camera. I knew. And yet I turned around anyway and saw the folded piece of paper on my vanity, crisp, neat, as if they wanted me to read it before anything else. Now you have the look that fits you, old and pathetic. That was all it said. No signature, no apology, just those words, each one slicing through my gut like glass. 72 years. I've carried my share of pain, lost a husband, raised a son, survived cancer, built my own investment firm when no man in the industry would take me seriously. I've spoken on stages, mentored women, managed millions. I never thought humiliation would feel like this. I didn't cry, not yet. But I did sit back down, because in that moment, I realized something. They thought this would stop me. They thought I would call the station and cancel my appearance, that I would hide behind curtains and shame, that I would let them win. I can still hear their voices from the night before. Jade giggling in the kitchen. Daniel talking low, like always when he was lying. I should have known something was off when they offered to stay overnight, said they wanted to help me get ready for the big day, said they wanted to be supportive. But it was just positioning, getting close enough to strike. I had left my door unlocked. I remember laying out the dress, hanging it just right, turning on the classical playlist I always listened to before public appearances. I remember feeling proud, not for the award, not even for the cameras, but because at 72, I had lived with integrity, and now they had reduced all that to a joke. But not for long. I stood up again and walked to the bathroom. The reflection was jarring. My eyes looked older, smaller somehow, my scalp pale and exposed under the light. But I didn't turn away. I reached for my phone. Maria picked up on the second ring. I said one sentence. "Bring the ash blonde shoulder-length wig, the one with the volume." She didn't ask questions. She knows me, has for 30 years. Next, I texted my stylist to come to the house. Makeup, lashes, the works. If I was going to walk into that studio, I would not do it looking like a victim. I'd do it looking like the woman who raised a son alone while managing to outperform 3 corporate CEOs. I didn't bother waking Daniel or Jade. I knew they would be sleeping soundly in the guest room, smug and satisfied, thinking they had outmaneuvered the old woman. But that was their mistake. They thought silence meant surrender. The stylist arrived within the hour. Maria followed with 2 garment bags. She didn't say a word about the missing hair or the torn gown. She just opened the bags and laid out options like a general prepping a soldier. I picked a dark green sheath dress with long sleeves and a high collar. Understated, powerful. The kind of dress you wear when you're preparing for war, but smiling like it's a family dinner. While they worked on my hair and face, I sat there and let the silence wrap around me. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was cold, focused, the way I used to feel when walking into a boardroom full of men waiting for me to fail. Daniel and Jade had crossed a line. They hadn't just tried to humiliate me. They had tried to erase me. And for what? For money I hadn't even given them yet. For control over an empire they didn't build. For the sick satisfaction of watching me disappear. But I wasn't going anywhere. At exactly 11:07 a.m., I stepped out of the front door and into the black sedan waiting for me. The driver opened the door. I smiled politely and slid in. This was still my day. My name was still on that script. My face was still going live in front of millions. They wanted to silence me. They had no idea what I was about to say. And to everyone watching from home, if you've ever felt like your own family tried to write you out of your own story, just wait. You're going to want to hear what happened next. The drive to the studio was quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because my mind was already busy filing everything into place. I've always been a woman who thinks in systems. I don't react with chaos. I analyze. I take inventory. This morning I didn't just lose my hair. I lost the last illusion I had about my family. I leaned back in the seat, fingers resting against the cool leather, and let the memories come. Not the loud ones, not the dramatic birthdays or the big achievements. No, the quiet moments, the ones that spoke the loudest in hindsight. Like the time Daniel turned 18, and instead of asking for a car or a party, he asked me to transfer some stocks into his name. Not because he understood how they worked, but because he had grown up believing everything I had would eventually be his. Not shared, not earned. His. I had laughed then, thought it was teenage confidence, a passing phase. I remember saying something like, "We'll talk about that when you start learning how to manage money." I didn't think much of it. But that was the first time I saw it. The entitlement, the expectation. And then there was Jade. She entered our lives with a smile too wide and questions too few. Never asked me about my work. Never wanted to know how I built the firm. Never curious about the deals I made or the clients I managed. Just polite small talk and fast compliments. Always calculated. Always just enough to sound warm. At first I thought she was just reserved. But over time, the cracks showed. She would make jokes about my wardrobe. Suggest that I take more relaxing roles at the firm. Once, during a holiday dinner, she told the whole table that she thought women over 70 should start thinking about their legacy instead of their LinkedIn. Everyone laughed, including Daniel. I remember how I smiled that night. Not because it was funny, but because I needed time. I needed to know if I was being paranoid or if this was the beginning of something deeper, something uglier. It wasn't just the remarks. It was the way they both started circling my financial life. Daniel began asking to review quarterly reports for the firm. Jade brought up estate planning during brunch. Their questions became more specific, then more frequent, then more direct. They wanted access, control, and they weren't hiding it anymore. Still, I waited. I didn't want to believe it had come to this. I raised Daniel alone after his father died. I built a company from scratch. I made sure he never missed a field trip, a dentist appointment, a birthday. I was never absent, not once. And for a while I thought that mattered. But Daniel had grown up in privilege, even if it wasn't obvious. He never had to wonder if the electricity bill would be paid, never had to watch me cry over bounced checks. He never knew about the nights I stayed up reading SEC regulations because I couldn't afford a lawyer in the early days. He only saw the results. The cars, the comfortable house, the clean kitchen, the nameplate on the office door, and he thought those things had always been there. He thought money just lived in the walls. When Jade came along, I knew instantly that she saw me as a gatekeeper, not a mother-in-law. She made it clear, in every conversation, that she had plans. Big ones, spa franchises, boutique hotels, Instagram partnerships, all needing capital, all needing investors. And each time I said no, the tension grew. Last year they invited me to dinner. A private celebration, they said. Just us, no waiters. Jade had cooked. Daniel poured the wine. It was too perfect. Halfway through the meal, Daniel pulled out a folder. A proposal. A power of attorney agreement. Just in case something happened, he said, just until the legal matters of aging became more pressing, it would simplify things. I looked at them. Their eyes sparkled with anticipation. Like they had rehearsed this. Like they were already picturing the signatures, the transfers, the clean path forward. Without me. I declined. Politely. Then firmly. Then with silence. After that, the warmth in our interactions cooled. Not instantly, but gradually. Fewer visits, fewer calls, more passive-aggressive remarks about my schedule. Jade started suggesting I take longer vacations. Daniel joked about how hard it was to be next in line. What line? I thought. There was no line. This wasn't a monarchy. This was my life, my work, my decisions. The more they pushed, the more I pulled back. I began auditing my accounts, locking down access points, moving investments into trusts with conditions they couldn't touch. I hired Eleanor again after nearly a decade. We didn't talk about wills. We talked about shields. At the time, I wasn't angry. I was sad. Sad that my own son saw me not as a parent, but as a roadblock. Sad that love had become leverage. Sad that the home I built had turned into a blueprint for conquest. But sadness has a shelf life. And this morning, when I found myself stripped of dignity, of peace, of privacy, the sadness expired. In its place, a different feeling took root. Clarity, not rage, not panic, but precision. They had made their move. Now, it was my turn. By the time we reached the studio, my plan had already taken shape. It wasn't fully formed yet, not down to the last detail, but the bones were there. Years of running boardrooms had taught me that clarity wasn't something you waited for. It was something you claimed, one step at a time. I stepped out of the car, heels steady on the concrete, posture straight. The producer greeted me at the entrance with a big smile, complimented my dress, my poise. No one mentioned the obvious, that I looked different, that something was missing, that something had been taken, and that was fine. Let them think whatever they wanted. Maria waited for me inside the green room. She was sitting on the small couch, hands clasped together like she was praying for strength. She stood up when I walked in, but didn't say anything until the door closed behind us. She asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with this. I nodded, then I handed her my phone and gave her 3 instructions. 1. Call Eleanor. Tell her to be at my house by 4 p.m. 2. Pull up the file we had discussed 2 months ago, the one marked Foundation Draft. 3. Do not, under any circumstance, tell anyone what was about to happen. She didn't argue. She just nodded and got to work. The makeup artist came in next. I let her do what she needed to do. Light foundation, strong eye, neutral lips. As she worked, I stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror didn't look wounded anymore. She looked focused, determined, ready. After the final touch, the stylist rechecked my hairpiece. It was secure, neat, but not too perfect. The kind of hairstyle that said I had nothing to prove. The segment producer came in to give me a rundown of the taping schedule. I listened carefully, then asked for one minor change. Instead of having the host read my biography, I wanted to say a few words myself at the beginning. Just a short message, I said. A reflection on the journey. She looked hesitant, but agreed. I had been in this business long enough to know how to use my reputation when I needed it. While I waited for the countdown, I closed my eyes and went through each part of the plan again. Step 1 was already in motion. Step 2 required timing. Step 3 would be the moment they never saw coming. The cameras rolled at 1 p.m. The lights came up. The host smiled, said her opening lines, welcomed the audience. Then she turned to me and gestured. I leaned forward slightly, smiled politely, and spoke. I started with gratitude. For the years, for the opportunities, for the people who had helped me build a career when I had nothing but drive and a stack of rejection letters. Then I shifted. I spoke about the cost of success, about how women my age were often celebrated in public while being quietly erased at home. I spoke without bitterness, but every word carried weight. When I finished, the room was silent. The host looked taken aback. She quickly picked up the script and moved forward, but I had already said what I needed to say. The interview continued as planned. Questions about my early days in broadcasting, my transition into finance, my role as a mentor, I answered with clarity, warmth, but never let go of the edge I had brought with me. After the taping ended, I stood and thanked the crew. Then I walked out of the studio, past the makeup mirrors, past the cameras, past the people who now looked at me a little differently. Maria met me at the car. She handed me my phone and said it was done. I called Eleanor from the back seat. She answered on the first ring. She asked if it was happening today. I said yes. She didn't waste time. She told me she would have the revised trust documents ready by 4 p.m., just like I asked. We would remove Daniel and Jade as secondary beneficiaries. We would freeze the pending disbursement for the investment project Daniel had requested. And we would finalize the registration for the Women's Business Fund I had quietly drafted 2 months ago, when I first began to suspect something was coming. Eleanor didn't ask why. She just did the job. I got home around 2:30. The house was quiet. Daniel and Jade were gone. Probably out celebrating. Maybe shopping. Maybe sitting at a brunch table somewhere, sipping mimosas and laughing about how I'd look on television with half my hair missing. I went upstairs. The mess in my room had already been cleaned by the housekeeper, but the image remained. I could still feel the hollow weight of that first moment, even if I had already turned it into fuel. I opened my laptop and began pulling files, financial statements, voice memos, screenshots. I didn't need to use them, not yet, but I wanted them ready. Then I sat back in my chair and stared out the window. It wasn't just about punishment. That wasn't what this was for me. It was about reclaiming the space they had tried to shrink, about drawing a line around my dignity and refusing to let anyone cross it again. For years I had been generous, not just with money, but with my time, my energy, my love. I gave and gave, believing it would be enough, believing that what I built would one day be respected by the very people I built it for. But the truth was simpler. Some people don't value what they didn't earn. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the trust documents Eleanor had sent over. Every clause was clear, every safeguard locked. If anything happened to me, there would be no confusion. The new primary beneficiary was listed as the Rowan Women's Fund, dedicated to training, funding, and mentoring women over 50 starting their first businesses. The moment I hit sign, I felt something inside me shift. Not rage, not satisfaction, relief, a calm kind of power. It was no longer about them, it was about me, and what I was ready to protect. The front lobby of the station had changed since the last time I was here. Cleaner, brighter, more modern. The old reception desk was gone, replaced with something sleeker. Everything had been updated except the weight I carried in my chest. I walked through the doors with my head held steady, no security badge needed. My face was still known, at least in this building. I had been on their airwaves long before half the new team was even hired. As soon as I crossed the turnstiles, a young intern jumped up from behind the desk and called for a floor producer. They offered me coffee. I declined. I didn't want anything in my hands that could shake. The elevator ride to the 7th floor was silent. I stared at my reflection in the mirror panel on the back wall. Wig secure, eyes calm, shoulders straight. The green dress Maria had chosen fit me like armor. When the doors opened, the hallway was already buzzing. People were moving fast, staffers holding clipboards, sound techs adjusting mics, someone running lines under their breath. But when I stepped into view, it all slowed. Conversations paused, heads turned. I felt every pair of eyes. Not because of fame, not because I was the guest of the day, but because of the silence that had followed me into the room, the kind of silence people don't talk about, the kind that arrives before something changes. The lead producer approached me. He was younger than I remembered, maybe early 30s, polished, polite, but his voice carried a subtle tension. He told me the host had been briefed, that she would stay on script, that there would be time for my prepared remarks during the final segment. I listened without interruption, then asked to see the cue cards. He hesitated, then handed them over. I read them quickly. Fluff questions, highlights of my career, mentions of legacy and mentorship. All safe, all comfortable. I handed them back and smiled. I told him there wouldn't be any surprises. He looked relieved. I didn't correct him. Backstage, I sat alone. No handlers, no family. Just me, and the moment I had built over a lifetime. I looked around the green room. Same grey chairs, same faded rug, same bowl of grapes no one ever ate. On the far wall was a framed poster of a broadcast from 15 years ago. My face was on it, slightly younger, a little softer. I remember that day. I had given a speech about media responsibility. It was the last time I had addressed the station from that chair. Now I would speak from a different place entirely. The wardrobe assistant came in and adjusted the mic pack, checked the batteries, clipped the wire beneath the collar of my dress. She didn't say anything about the wig, just nodded once and left. That, more than anything, told me she knew. 5 minutes to air. Maria texted me from the parking lot. Just 3 words. All set. Quiet. Steady. Like her. I closed my eyes and took a breath, not to calm down. I wasn't nervous, but to remind myself of what this moment meant. They had tried to strip me of dignity. Now I would take it back, in full view of the audience they had hoped to impress. The stagehand came to walk me toward the set. I followed him down the corridor, past the production office, past the line of interns, and into the studio. Lights dimmed, cameras idle. Everything waiting. The host greeted me at the edge of the stage. Her smile was wide, professional, camera-ready. She complimented my outfit, told me how honored she was to have me back. I shook her hand and returned the smile. I could tell she sensed something was different, but she didn't ask. No one did. We took our seats. The floor director counted down, the lights rose, and we were live. The host launched into the intro, her words polished, practiced. She spoke of my career, my legacy, my contributions to both media and finance. She called me a trailblazer. I kept my eyes on her, steady, nodding when appropriate, smiling when needed. The first few questions were expected. Career milestones, mentorship, the challenges of being a woman in a man's world. I answered smoothly, warm but firm, no deviation, no signals. Then came the moment we had agreed upon. The host leaned forward and said she understood I had prepared something to say directly to the audience. I nodded, took the cue, and turned toward camera 3. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I spoke the way I always had. Calm, direct, clear. I thanked the network for honoring me. I thanked the viewers who had supported my work over the years. I acknowledged the younger generation of women coming up behind me. Then I paused, and I spoke the next line without blinking. This morning, before the sun came up, I experienced something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Someone, under the same roof where I had offered warmth and trust, violated both. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I continued. I talked about the difference between legacy and possession, about how people can smile at you with affection and still hold a knife behind their back, about the way women over 70 are often treated like they've expired. I told the truth without revealing the full story, and yet I knew it had landed. The room was quiet, the crew still, the host frozen in her seat. When I finished, I thanked them once more and turned back in my chair. The segment ended 2 minutes later. The cameras cut, the lights lowered, and just like that, the room exhaled. The host stood up and hugged me. Her voice shook slightly when she said thank you. I smiled again, gently, and walked off the stage. Back in the hallway, the energy had shifted. I could feel it behind me. Whispers, shuffled steps, half-finished sentences. I didn't turn around. In the parking lot, Maria waited with the car door open. I got in. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to, because the first strike had landed, and they had no idea what was coming next. I had delivered what they thought was the speech. What they didn't know was that it was only the beginning. By the time the afternoon broadcast replayed, the edited segment had already begun to circulate online. A few media outlets clipped parts of it. One platform labeled it a masterclass in controlled honesty. Another simply called it quiet fire. I didn't care much for headlines, but I cared that people were paying attention. I returned home around 5. Maria stayed with me for a while, preparing tea, turning off unnecessary lights, keeping the phone away from me. She had always known when I needed silence more than words. Upstairs, I changed out of the green dress and into a navy sweater, the same one I wore to Daniel's college graduation. It no longer carried warmth, only irony. I sat down at my desk and opened the folder marked Primary Proof. Inside were 3 files, 2 audio clips, 1 document. The first audio clip was dated 3 weeks ago, a dinner at my home. Daniel had forgotten his phone was recording, or maybe he thought I wouldn't know how to retrieve the deleted files. He was wrong. In that recording, he told Jade that the only thing standing between them and full control was my signature. He said I was too proud to see that my time was up, that eventually, with a little more pressure, I'd hand everything over. He laughed when he said it. The second clip was worse. It was taken from the guest room hallway. Maria had installed a discreet audio recorder after I expressed suspicions about late-night conversations I wasn't meant to hear. This one caught Jade explaining her plan to stage a minor accident. Not physical harm, just enough to trigger concerns about my memory, enough to justify legal intervention. She called it strategic nudging. I saved both clips to a secure drive, then uploaded them to a private folder with read-only access. I created a link. That link would be my anchor. The document was a printed transcript of Daniel's attempts to access restricted accounts from my firm's internal platform. Eleanor had discovered the traces during a routine audit. 3 login attempts from an unrecognized device, all tied back to Daniel's home IP address. That night, I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I called Greg Stanton, former mentee, now a senior editor for a respected financial publication. We hadn't spoken in months, but his voice was calm and steady the moment he picked up. I told him I had something he needed to hear. We met at a small cafe off East 59th, corner table, no one around. I handed him a single flash drive, no explanation, just a date and time. He nodded, no questions, just a quiet understanding. Later that day, Greg sent me a message. He said he had listened to the clips, reviewed the document. He asked if I wanted to go public. I told him not yet. First, I wanted one more opportunity, a controlled environment, live, unfiltered. I called the station and asked for a follow-up segment, a continuation, framed as a deeper conversation about aging, legacy, and the dangers of mismanagement within families. I told them I would be willing to speak on record. They agreed faster than I expected. The new taping was scheduled for Friday afternoon, same host, same set. This time, fewer filters. In the green room, the air felt heavier, not tense, just loaded, the way a courtroom feels before a verdict. Maria sat next to me, quiet. She had stayed overnight, just in case. Jade and Daniel were nowhere to be found. 10 minutes before showtime, I reviewed my outline. No script, just bullet points and the link, a simple code embedded in the station's teleprompter. I had worked in television long enough to know how to make a delivery feel spontaneous while controlling every word. When we went live, I let the host lead for the first segment. She was respectful, sharp, and professional, but I could feel her curiosity. She knew something was coming. Midway through the broadcast, I made my move. I leaned forward and said I wanted to share something that had been sitting with me. A personal realization about the cost of silence. The camera zoomed slightly. The room held its breath. I said that legacy was not about what we leave behind, but about what we protect while we're still here. I said that trust can be broken with whispers and strategy, that even love can be weaponized by those who believe inheritance is a birthright rather than a privilege. Then I mentioned a sound I hadn't forgotten. Laughter, the kind that sounds innocent unless you know what's behind it. I paused, then gave the host a nod. She cued the clip. In the control room, someone pressed play. The audio ran through the studio feed. Daniel's voice filled the air, saying I wouldn't last much longer, that after I was out of the picture, the real work could begin, that Jade had already drafted a proposal to remodel the house, that they were counting the months. Then Jade's voice, calm and clipped, saying it would be easier if I slipped, that a little confusion, a small mistake, would make the court filings smoother, that Eleanor could be pressured, that Maria would fold if offered enough. The clip ended. Silence returned. No one moved. The host turned toward me slowly. I said nothing. I let the audio speak for itself. Then I finished with one final sentence. I said the biggest mistake people make when scheming is forgetting that age does not mean absence. The segment ended without further commentary. As the credits rolled, I stood and walked off the set. Backstage, the staff avoided eye contact. A few murmured good luck. One man gave a quick nod before turning away. I exited the building without waiting for applause. The truth had landed. And from this moment forward, nothing would be the same. By the time I got home, the clip had already started circulating. It wasn't just the station's version anymore. Independent blogs had picked it up. Podcasts were breaking it down, frame by frame. The audio, raw and undeniable, carried more weight than any speech I could have written. I didn't look at the comments. I didn't read the headlines. I knew what was coming. But I wasn't finished. What I shared on air was only the surface. It was what people needed to hear first. What would plant the seed of doubt in those who still saw my son and his wife as respectable. But the rest, the numbers, the paper trail, the pattern, was where the real story lived. And I was ready to bring it forward. I met Eleanor at my house the next morning. She arrived exactly at 9, with 2 briefcases and a thermos of coffee. We sat at the dining table. No small talk, no recap, just facts. She opened the first briefcase and laid out a series of printed reports, financial statements, internal access logs, flagged transfers. Everything that had been quietly collected over the last 6 months. There were multiple entries. 3 unauthorized login attempts to my firm's secure system. Each one traced back to Daniel's home network. The amounts involved weren't small. One transfer request was for a 7-figure amount, cleverly masked under an old development proposal. Another involved reclassifying a joint account I had closed years ago. None of them had gone through. My internal team had blocked them. But it proved intent. Intent to defraud. Intent to bypass legal oversight. Intent to take what wasn't theirs. Jade's digital footprint was also in the mix. 2 suspicious PDF files forwarded to an unknown legal contact. One of them included a draft petition to request a financial conservatorship. The other listed personal notes about my supposed decline in judgment. Fabricated. Annotated. Time-stamped. I reviewed every page without flinching. Then I signed the release papers. We would submit them to 2 places. First, to Greg, for the article he was preparing. Second, to the Attorney General's office, not to press charges immediately, but to establish a record, a formal one. I told Eleanor I wanted to maintain control of the timeline. I didn't want this to look like revenge. I wanted it to look like what it was, correction. After she left, I sat alone for a while. The house felt heavier than usual, the air too still, but I didn't move. I needed to stay in the weight of what was coming next. That afternoon, the station called. They had received over 500 emails and dozens of calls asking for clarification. People wanted to know what I had meant, if what I implied was true, if Daniel and Jade were involved. I didn't give them a statement. Instead, I requested one more appearance. This time, I would speak alone. No host, no questions, just a monologue. They agreed. They were too curious not to. The final taping was scheduled for Saturday evening, prime hour, full audience. Backstage, I wore black, not for mourning, but because it grounded me. Maria sat behind the curtain. She didn't ask what I planned to say. She knew better than anyone that I rarely wrote anything down. My memory, despite what Jade had implied, was still sharper than most. When the cameras rolled, I stepped into the center of the stage. No chair, no backdrop, just me, a mic, and the spotlight. I began by thanking those who had written to me, for their support, for their questions, for their willingness to see beneath the surface. Then I walked them through the numbers. I didn't name Daniel. I didn't name Jade. But I spoke of the unauthorized attempts. I spoke of the transfers, the forged documents, the patterns. I spoke of trust, not as a feeling, but as a legal instrument, something built over decades and threatened in weeks. I held up one page, just one, a screen capture of the login log showing the IP address, the failed password entries, the timestamps. I said nothing as the camera zoomed in. Then I spoke of resilience, of what it meant to build something from scratch, to survive loss and rebuild, to raise a child without a partner and still deliver excellence, and to watch that child, as an adult, try to dismantle everything you worked for, simply because they believed they had waited long enough. I let the words hang in the air, not bitter, not angry, just true. And then I ended with this. I said that sometimes love isn't enough to keep people honest, that sometimes blood doesn't mean loyalty, that sometimes the person you raise is not the person who will hold you upright when the storm comes. But that never means you fold. You adapt, you protect, you rebuild, and above all, you choose yourself. The lights faded, the credits rolled, and I walked off stage knowing I had just shifted the ground beneath their feet. The morning after the broadcast, I woke to an inbox full of headlines. They called it a reckoning, a lesson, a warning. They used words like bold and unshakable. But I didn't feel any of those things. I felt quiet, like something had finally settled into place after years of being held just slightly off balance. Maria poured coffee while the news played in the background. No names were mentioned, but the message had been received. My voice, measured and calm, had cut deeper than any accusation. Still, there was one step left. I had told the truth. I had shared the betrayal. I had offered the facts. Now I had to close the door. Eleanor arrived just after 9. She brought the final version of the documents, neatly printed, double-checked, notarized. We went through each page carefully, nothing rushed, nothing missed. The language was precise. My personal and business accounts, all consolidated under a single trust. The Rowan Women's Fund, effective immediately. Structured to operate independently. Governed by a board. Protected by clause after clause of legal reinforcement. Daniel and Jade were not listed, not as beneficiaries, not as advisors, not even as emergency contacts. There would be no confusion. If something happened to me tomorrow, the structure would hold. Maria watched from the kitchen. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her presence had become the anchor I leaned on without words. I signed the papers with a steady hand. Eleanor placed them in a fireproof folder, tucked into her case, and stood. Before she left, she paused. She said I had done something most people never find the strength to do. I thanked her and walked her to the door. When it closed behind her, the house went still again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It felt like air was moving again. At noon, I called the board members I had quietly selected over the past few months. Women I trusted, women I respected, women who had built things from the ground up, just like I had. We held a virtual meeting, short, direct. I introduced them to the fund, explained the mission, outlined the first steps. Then I gave them access. Full authority to operate, to identify candidates, to begin the process of supporting women over 50 who wanted to start their own businesses but had never been given the resources. They didn't ask about Daniel. They didn't ask about Jade. They focused on the future. After the meeting ended, I turned off my phone and sat by the window. The sun had shifted just enough to cast a long, narrow beam across the floorboards. I followed it with my eyes, watching it stretch past the furniture toward the far wall. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a woman preparing for war. I felt like someone who had already won. That evening, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a journalist or a station executive. It was Daniel. I didn't pick up. He called again, then again. I let them ring. Eventually, he left a voicemail. His voice was thinner than usual, the confident tone replaced by something more raw. He said he had seen the trust filing. He said he understood what I had done. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't defend himself. He just said that if there was anything left to say, he would be willing to listen. I deleted the message without responding. There was nothing left to explain. The next morning, I received an email from Jade. It was long, apologetic, carefully written. She used words like misunderstanding and regret. She mentioned therapy. She said she hoped the media storm would die down soon. She signed off with her full name. I archived it. By the third day, the media had moved on. Another scandal had taken its place, another story with louder noise. But for those who mattered, the message had landed. The house grew quieter with each passing hour. But the quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. The kind of space I hadn't allowed myself in years. No footsteps stomping up the stairs, no slamming cabinet doors, no passive remarks at breakfast, no tension crawling beneath the surface of every conversation. Just silence and freedom. That weekend, I hosted a small dinner, not for celebration, but for acknowledgement. Maria helped set the table. A few close friends came. Women who had been part of my life through storms and stillness. We ate slowly, talked openly, laughed without watching the door. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't mention the trust. Instead, I spoke about the fund, about the women we could reach, about the lives we could change. And for the first time, I saw something shift in their eyes. Not pity, not worry, pride. They knew what I had done, and they understood why. When the night ended, and the house went still again, I stood in the kitchen and looked around. It no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like mine. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within 72 hours, Daniel's name was pulled from the advisory board of 2 investment firms. Not suspended, removed. Quietly but with finality. The press releases used vague language about internal restructuring. But the timing told the truth. Clients began pulling out of his consulting business. First in small waves, then in a tide. I had nothing to do with it. Not directly. I hadn't spoken a single name in public. But the pattern spoke for itself. And people in finance know how to read between lines. By the end of the week, one of his largest accounts filed a formal complaint with the ethics board. The board had no choice but to launch a preliminary inquiry, not because of what I said, but because of what he had tried to do. The attempted access to private accounts, the manipulation of trust structures, the conflict of interest. The professional world is colder than family. They don't need to yell. They just stop returning calls. Jade was hit harder, and quicker. She had built a career in branding, image. She sold herself as someone who understood legacy, who advised companies on how to craft narratives around generational wealth. Her entire pitch was built on the idea of respectability. But no amount of curated photos or thoughtful captions could undo what had already landed. The video clip of her voice had spread beyond finance. It landed in parenting forums. It trended on small business networks. It became the topic of late-night commentary. People called it chilling. They dissected the phrase strategic nudging. They debated whether it was elder abuse. They compared it to similar cases that had ended in court. No charges had been filed, no lawsuit was pending. But it didn't matter. Reputation is a kind of currency, and hers had gone bankrupt. Her clients cancelled meetings, her sponsors pulled out. A podcast interview she had scheduled was removed from the platform without explanation. She posted a statement online. 2 paragraphs, measured. Apologetic in tone, but vague in meaning. She used phrases like personal challenges and family miscommunication. The response was immediate. Silence. No one bought it. No one shared it. No one defended her. Within days, her accounts went quiet, and I did nothing to interfere. It was the silence that undid them. Not my voice, not my facts, but the vacuum left behind when they could no longer control the version of the story being told. At home, I kept my routine steady. Early mornings, long walks, phone off after 7. The news played in the background, but I stopped paying attention after the 5th panel show dissected the situation without ever mentioning names. They didn't need names. The story had already been drawn in broad strokes. The details only made it sharper. By the end of the 2nd week, Daniel sent another message. This one longer. He said he had lost his apartment, that they had started dipping into savings, that Jade's income had dried up, that they were reconsidering everything. He didn't ask for money, not yet. He just said he was lost. I didn't respond. Some things are not for fixing, some consequences are not meant to be softened. He made choices, calculated ones, and now he was standing in the middle of their impact. Jade, I heard through someone else, had started looking for freelance work under a different name. A rebrand, a reset. But the internet has a long memory, the kind that follows you even when you change your name. I didn't take pleasure in their unraveling, not in the way people expect. There was no sense of victory, no champagne, no long exhale. Just stillness, a kind of quiet I hadn't known in years, because I no longer had to explain myself. I no longer had to protect the version of motherhood that had exhausted me. I no longer had to pretend that love could blind me to betrayal. I had chosen myself, and the world had kept turning. The fund, meanwhile, began its work. The first round of applications opened. Women wrote in from small towns and cities I had never heard of. Some had been nurses. Others had raised children full-time. A few had survived abusive relationships. All of them had ideas, plans, determination. We awarded the first grants by the end of the month. I read every application, every letter, every dream written in a voice that had waited too long to be heard. It reminded me why I had done what I did, not for punishment, not for revenge, but to protect something more important than blood. Integrity. At the grocery store one afternoon, I saw someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a woman from the old firm. She paused when she saw me, then smiled. She said quietly that she had watched everything. Then she said one sentence. "You reminded us how to hold the line." She didn't linger. She didn't ask for details. She just kept walking. And I stood there, beside a basket of oranges, feeling something return to me. Not approval, not forgiveness, but a sense of wholeness, like I had finally come home to myself. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Daniel showed up at my door. I hadn't seen him in person since everything fell apart. I had received his messages, his voicemails, his attempts to reach through the cracks, but I had left them unanswered, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had nothing left to say. And yet there he was, standing on my porch like a boy who had forgotten his keys. Maria wasn't home. That was probably for the best. I opened the door and looked at him. He looked thinner, older, his eyes tired, his clothes more wrinkled than he would have ever allowed before. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, waiting. So I stepped aside and let him in. We didn't go far, just into the front sitting room, the one with the piano that hadn't been played in years. He sat down slowly, as if the air itself was heavy. I stayed standing. He looked around the room like it was unfamiliar. Then he began. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't deny anything. What he said was simple. He said he had failed. He said he had thought he understood how things worked. That he believed, deep down, the life I had built would eventually become his. He called it inheritance. He called it natural. But then he paused and said that what he really believed was entitlement. He said he didn't know how to work for something without first expecting to receive it. And that was the part I finally sat down for, because I had waited a long time to hear something that honest. He went on. He said he had lost more than money. He had lost direction, pride, credibility, that even his friends had grown quiet, that Jade had moved back to her parents' home, that he couldn't look at himself in the mirror most mornings without feeling like a stranger. He said he knew he had crossed a line, that he hadn't just hurt me. He had undone years of trust with a few conversations and a few clicks. Then he looked at me and said something I didn't expect. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He said he knew that might not be possible. He just wanted to be heard. And for a moment, I let him be. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, looking at the man I had raised. Not the boy with scraped knees, not the college graduate with eyes full of ambition, but the man who had decided to trade loyalty for leverage. And then I spoke. I told him that there was a time when I would have given him everything without needing to be asked, that I had spent decades building something I thought we would share, not just assets, but values, and that somewhere along the way, I had mistaken proximity for understanding. I said I had believed that love would be enough, but love is not protection. Love does not justify betrayal. Love cannot be an excuse for silence. He nodded, eyes cast down. I told him that I hadn't cut him out to make a point. I did it because I had reached the end of what I could give without losing myself. That choosing the fund was not about revenge, it was about responsibility. That I had seen what he had done, not just in documents and recording things, but in choices. And that choices, even the quiet ones, leave fingerprints. He didn't interrupt. I told him that I had been angry, but that the anger had passed. What remained was something simpler, distance, and that I intended to keep it. I told him that I wished him growth, that I hoped he would rebuild, not for my approval, but for his own integrity, that if he ever wanted to become the kind of man who earned respect, not demanded it, then this chapter had to close. He sat still, not resisting, not begging, just sitting in the weight of what had been broken. Then he stood up. Slowly. He said thank you, quietly, and he walked to the door. I didn't follow him. I didn't watch him drive away. I just stayed in the chair and listened to the silence. And for the first time in my life, I accepted that my son was someone I no longer needed to understand. 2 weeks after Daniel left my house, I called the realtor. Her name was Claire. She had handled 2 properties for my firm in the past. Professional, discreet, efficient. I told her I was ready to list the house. She didn't ask why, just scheduled a meeting and sent the paperwork. I walked through the rooms the night before she came, not to say goodbye, but to take stock. The kitchen had been renovated twice. Once when Daniel started high school. Again after I had won an industry award and decided I deserved a proper stove. The dining room had hosted dozens of holidays, celebrations, and tense dinners where people smiled too tightly. The upstairs hallway still carried the creak in the floorboards near the third step. I had never fixed it. Somehow it made the house feel honest. I stood in the guest room doorway longer than the others. The bed was made, the lamps untouched. It looked peaceful. Deceptively so. That was where Jade had stayed. That was where they had laughed behind my back. I didn't cry. I just closed the door. The next morning, Claire walked the property with quiet attention. She asked if I wanted to stage the home or sell it as is. I told her I wanted it clean, but not fake. No exaggerated pillows or candles that smelled like nothing found in nature. She agreed and said the market was strong, that she expected multiple offers within the first week. I nodded. We signed the listing agreement at the dining room table. She left just after noon. I sat there for a while, tracing the grain in the wood with my finger. It felt less like an ending than I expected. That weekend I began packing. Not everything, just what I wanted to bring. Books, photographs, a few pieces of art. The old cast-iron pan that had seen more than its share of Sunday mornings. I hired movers for the rest. I didn't want to box up memories alone. It wasn't sadness that lingered in the air. It was dust, and I was tired of breathing it. I found a small cottage 2 hours south, near the coast, tucked behind a stretch of pine trees. The yard wasn't large, but it had sunlight in the morning and enough space for herbs. The floors were uneven, the windows older, but it felt human, lived in, ready. I closed on it in less than a month. I didn't tell anyone outside my attorney and Maria. There was no announcement, no goodbye party, no neighbours gathering at the curb, just a moving truck, a signature, and a last glance at the place that had once been everything. I left the keys in a clean white envelope on the kitchen counter. I arrived at the cottage on a Tuesday morning. The wind was soft. The porch steps creaked. The front door stuck slightly when I opened it. Inside, the air was cool and clean. Maria arrived that evening with groceries and a stack of mail forwarded from the old address. She placed them on the counter and smiled. She said the place suited me. I agreed. Over the next few days, I settled in. I learned the rhythm of the house, which windows caught the best light, which cupboard door needed a second tug. I planted rosemary in a clay pot near the back step. It grew quickly. The Rowan Women's Fund continued without issue. The board handled most operations now. They sent monthly updates. I read them with pride, quiet pride, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Letters from grant recipients began arriving, handwritten, typed, some with photos of a new bakery or a sewing studio or a daycare with walls painted in soft green. Each one reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. I had not just removed 2 people from my future, I had cleared space for others to step into it. One morning, I stood on the back porch with a cup of tea and listened to the birds. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy, just wind through branches and the soft scrape of squirrels chasing each other through the trees. It struck me how long it had been since my mornings started with silence instead of tension. No passive remarks, no half-shouted phone calls behind closed doors, no plans being made in the dark, just peace and presence. At night, I read novels I had once shelved for lack of time. I cooked simple meals. I slept without interruption. I stopped checking the news. The house had no television. I didn't miss it. The past still lived in pieces of me. That would never change. But the weight of it had lessened. Like something once strapped to my shoulders had finally been placed on the ground. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. And that, more than anything, felt like freedom. The mornings at the cottage had begun to take on a rhythm. By 6:30, the first light slid across the windowsill. I didn't need an alarm clock. My body adjusted. I would open the back door, let in the early air, and water the plants with slow, circular motions, like I had all the time in the world. And most days, I did. I started baking again. Not for a business, not for a client, just for myself. Banana bread, peach cobbler, simple loaves with rosemary and sea salt. The smell filled the cottage. Sometimes I shared them with neighbours. I met a few kind souls that way. There was Joan, who walked her golden retriever past my gate each morning. She reminded me of someone I once worked with, sharp but soft around the edges. And there was Harold, retired mechanic, who brought me a bag of oranges from his own tree just because I waved at him the day before. It wasn't loud joy. It was quiet contentment. After years of navigating tension, those small connections felt revolutionary. One afternoon, I received a call from the local women's centre. They had heard about the Rowan Women's Fund and asked if I'd be willing to speak at one of their events. I almost declined. I wasn't interested in telling my story as if it were a clean arc of triumph, but I asked if I could simply attend first. Listen. Observe. They welcomed me. That Thursday evening, I walked into a room filled with folding chairs and homemade cookies. No stage, no microphone, just women. Dozens of them. Different ages, races, walks of life. Talking in pairs, in groups, some sitting alone. I sat in the back. They didn't know who I was. I liked it that way. They spoke about credit scores, about escaping toxic relationships, about the small victories that made up real freedom. A woman named Laurel talked about starting her first savings account at age 52. Another, younger, told us she had just filed for divorce after 8 years of being called worthless. The room didn't erupt into applause. It stayed quiet, respectful, deep. At the end, they invited anyone to share a few words. I didn't stand up, but I wrote a check before I left, quietly, without asking for recognition. The next day, I received a thank you card in the mail, handwritten, from someone named Sylvia. She said she didn't know who I was, but that someone in the room had told her a kind soul had donated enough to cover 3 months of rent for one of the members. She wrote that she hoped that person knew their gesture mattered. I placed the card in the drawer beside my bed. It stayed there. I didn't call Daniel, not once. He didn't call me either. I sometimes wondered if he had married Jade, if they had kept the house or flipped it for profit, but the thought came and went like a cloud. No thunder, no storm, just passing weather. What I knew for certain was this. I had removed myself from their narrative. I had stepped out of the role they had written for me. No longer the quiet supporter, no longer the silent backer of their ambitions. I was my own. I didn't need the world to know it, but I knew it. One morning, as I returned from the farmer's market, I saw 2 young women sitting outside the coffee shop near Main Street. They were going over paperwork, visibly frustrated. One of them held her head in her hands. I offered them a smile as I passed, and for some reason, the one with short hair stood up and asked if I knew anything about grant writing. I paused, told her I might. They asked if I had a moment. I sat with them, listened to their plan. A mobile health van for rural women. They had heart, good intentions, terrible formatting on their proposal. I offered to help, gave them my number. A week later, they emailed me a draft. I returned it with notes. They got the grant. They sent flowers. I didn't need them. But I kept the card. In time, word got around that a woman named Patricia, quiet and patient, knew how to get things done. I started receiving emails from people I had never met. Some just needed guidance. Others needed a steady hand. I never charged a cent. I didn't want to go back to consulting full-time. But this felt different, like giving without cost, like balance. That fall, I hosted a gathering. Nothing big, just 6 women. All of them had started something, a home business, a non-profit, a new life. We sat on my back porch with pie and cider and blankets. We didn't talk about pain. We didn't talk about betrayal. We talked about plans, possibilities, futures. As the sun dipped low and the trees cast long shadows across the yard, I looked around the table and felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. Not revenge, not relief. Peace, earned, not given, and for the first time in a long time, I realized something important. Not every justice has to be loud. Some arrive quietly through the lives we help rebuild. The first snow fell late that year. It came in the middle of the night, soft and slow, like a whispered apology from the sky. When I opened the curtains that morning, everything outside looked clean again. Even the gravel driveway had a quiet dignity to it, tucked beneath a layer of white. I stood at the window for a long time, mug warm in my hands, watching, not thinking, just being. It had been nearly 2 years since I left everything behind. The house, the business, my son. The grief used to arrive like a wave. Now it was a tide. Present, but no longer crashing, just pulling gently, reminding me of what had once been mine and what I had chosen to let go. I didn't regret it. Not the cottage, not the silence, not even the final severance from Daniel. I had rebuilt not a home, but a self. Some days that still surprised me. The morning mail brought a holiday card, glossy, a photo of Daniel and Jade, matching sweaters, a toddler sitting on Jade's lap with a tight red bow around her head. I stared at it longer than I should have. There was no note, just the photo, a message without words, like they wanted me to see what they had built, or maybe what they thought I had lost. I placed it back in the envelope and slid it into the drawer without a sound. I didn't cry. I didn't feel bitterness, just distance. The kind that had once been painful, now simply protective. I turned back to the kitchen. My pie crusts were resting, the oven warming. I had invited a few women over for a quiet end-of-year dinner. Nothing grand, just a table full of roasted root vegetables, warm bread, stories, and laughter that didn't carry the sharpness of old wounds. That night, the cottage filled with the scent of cinnamon and citrus. Joan brought her famous apple crisp. Harold dropped off a bottle of local wine at the gate, shy as ever, and waved from his truck. The evening passed like the snowfall, unhurried, gentle, whole. As the women left, wrapping scarves and sharing hugs, one of them turned back and touched my arm. She said, "You remind us that it's never too late to begin again." I didn't have the words to respond, but I smiled. When they were gone, I stepped out onto the porch. The snow was still falling. I looked up into it, let the flakes land on my face. And in that moment, there were no headlines, no betrayals, no battles left to fight, just a woman standing in the stillness, alive, undiminished, and finally free. If this story touched something deep inside you, you're not alone. Many of us carry quiet wounds, especially when they come from the people we once trusted most. But strength can take the shape of silence, of rebuilding, of choosing peace over chaos. Have you ever walked away from something toxic and found a better version of yourself on the other side? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the reminder someone else needs tonight.